Hello, I'm Anavultus, and welcome to Getting the Answers with, of course, my excellent co host.
Berckenhoff, woo! The breakdown
Yeah,
with Berckenhoff, yay!
yeah, so today we will be, of course, discussing the Biden administration. Some things have already happened, but we will also be discussing perhaps some of our interests in what perhaps might be happening in the future as events unfold. So look forward to that. I'll let you start. What do you think so far?
Well, the inauguration day itself wasn't that unexpected because I mean it's not like anything happened that I didn't expect from previous ones from happening. You know, you always have a lot of like speakers, you have the same sort of talking points. I knew what Biden was going to say about because he's been pushing unity even before inauguration, so he's trying to be like the president of unity, so to speak. So nothing really surprised me there. I don't want to get too sidetracked off of the point, but another thing that was a little bit weird before the actual inauguration day and Biden being formally president was the factor of the way they were vetting National Guard members for it, because it seemed rather bizarre. But that's a whole probably topic just in itself. So I found that surprising um, before the actual presidency. But for actually Biden himself, I think I guess the best way to put it is I see more of sort of how Obama was president and the factor of he might do a couple things that are relatively big, such as, Obama when he did the healthcare. But for the most part of his presidency, I don't think he's going to necessarily do something crazy and cause, massive problems.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Now, of course, it really depends on what you mean by something crazy. For example, I noticed on Trump's farewell address that he was mentioning that he did not begin a new major conflict, which is, of course, something which cannot be said for the Obama Biden administration in the past. So I think something that people will probably be looking forward to in the Biden administration, which is, in fact, something that people had criticized Trump over, is that Biden may be becoming more aggressive in foreign policy than Trump was, when militarily speaking. Of course, Trump did have his trade wars, and they worked and didn't work in certain ways, and that's not really the topic here. But a lot of people were critical of Trump for not being more aggressive militarily in Syria, among other things. And of course, when I say a lot of people, I don't mean the general population, because oftentimes these wars aren't very popular among the general population. But it is very much the foreign policy establishment in Washington, on Capitol Hill, and in the Department of State that very frequently was at odds with Donald Trump's policies. And I think with Joe Biden, they will see a return to the status quo of the Obama Biden administration, going back to Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Reagan, and further back. So, in that sense, it is a sort of return to that administration's foreign policy, which focuses very much on cooperation, on international agencies and international treaties, while also being aggressive toward Russia and its allies.
For sure. I'd just like to, I guess you say, piggyback on your first point there. Was kind of, I guess you could say, ironic about war is that the progressive left in general has always been somewhat against war. And some of the right is and not, because it depends on how they view it, which I found rather interesting because I've been looking more into war, because it's something that interests me more in the factor of not like tanks and stuff like that, but rather why we get into wars. And I mean, most of it's money reasons and whatnot, and that's why there's continuous wars, at least from the research I've done so far. But the reason I brought that up really is it is a major point, because I think more people are starting to see these continuous wars as bad. So Trump didn't remove anybody from war, so to speak, but he didn't add to it. So I do think that that was one of the big victories that Trump did have. Um, so I'm glad that he did bring that up. But I also do agree that there's probably going to be at least a higher chance of there being another war, if not going to be another sort of conflict. Maybe not necessarily war, but some conflict overseas or whatnot.
Yeah, and that's not to say that Trump didn't get close to having war a couple times. For example, China was planning to invade Taiwan at some point last year, and that didn't go through, and that may have caused a war if that had happened. But it really depends on how the U.S. would have responded to that. But in a more direct case on Trump, I would say Iran had a couple of places and times when it was close to war. For example, the event with a ship that got damaged in the straits off the Persian Gulf. I think it's the Strait of Hormuz. A ship got damaged, and people were saying that it was the Iranians that had damaged it. And then there were some people saying that it was a false flag attack, and the U.S. had deployed naval resources into the region. So it looked like there might be some conflict, but it didn't happen ultimately. Another event would be the killing of Soleimani. And although Trump considers it an achievement, I personally have been critical of it because, regardless of whether or not he was an enemy of a country, he was killed in the territory of a neutral country, which, based on the fact that he is a uniformed combatant in the military of a sovereign state, is something that would go against the treaties that the U.S. has signed. So that is a problem in some respect. And there was a reprisal, but it didn't lead to a full escalation. And of course, towards the very end, Iran was attempting to be somewhat aggressive towards the U.S., but nothing happened there.
Right. Yeah, I remember that whole situation. It seems like it was not Trump's administration, because it just everything gets all crazy. But yeah, I remember that whole thing when it happened, and kind of the chaos that was all around that situation. Uh, I guess I'm gonna ask one question just on this topic, and then we could probably move on to the next one. But and you may not even have an answer necessarily to it, but what do you kind of see from a Biden administration? Like, what do you think the conflict's going to be?
The
Is it going to
conflict,
be, yeah,
well, I think we will perhaps see something similar to what has been happening in the past. For example, I would say the Arab Spring and the Euromaidan protests, and also the Free Hong Kong movement, have all been supported by the U.S. behind the scenes. And this isn't a big secret, because you can track the NGOs and link them back to the Department of State. You can look up Operation Timber Sycamore and find out that the reason why Ambassador Stevens had been in Benghazi, and the whole Benghazi Gate event occurred, was because the U.S. was actually sending weapons through Benghazi, through Turkey and Jordan into Syria, in those stages of the rebellion. So, in that sense, these Twitter revolutions, as people call them, that occurred in a number of countries recently, are revolutions wherein the activists behind them are trained and funded by American NGOs that are linked with the Department of State. And this becomes very obvious once you see the eventual involvement of the U.S. more actively, as the CIA was giving weapons to certain groups, and then multiple U.S. intelligence agencies were arming rival groups in Syria. That was a funny news story that came out. So it is well known that Ukraine, Syria, and Egypt and other places have gotten into a lot of escalation in revolts, largely due to U.S. involvement. And this is part of a larger strategy to shore up against Russia, because, of course, Syria is an ally of Russia, not a close ally, but an ally nevertheless, as is Iran. And Ukraine is right next to Russia, so getting the Ukraine to be aligned with the West, particularly Europe and America, is strategically speaking an advantageous move for the U.S. So in that sense, we may be seeing sort of similar events happening in various countries, and as part of an expanding campaign against Russia. Now, personally, I think that Russia isn't really in a position to expand currently, so I don't think this is necessary at all. I think that more direct actions against China would probably be more strategically advantageous. And to do these rather than secretly, openly, would be much more honorable, I think, as well. But that's not really the plans of a lot of the Democrats and the Biden administration, who have focused a lot more on being adversarial to Russia than to China. Now, that being said, as China becomes increasingly bold foreign policy wise, that may change, but we will have to see, especially if certain allegations concerning the Biden's involvement with China are true. Then we may see an administration that isn't really focused on protecting the U.S.'s position internationally against China's expansion.
Right, and isn't there already a impeachment from, I believe it was a senator, who going against Biden for his involvement with foreign affairs? Is kind of where they're coming from.
Yes, I don't think it'll go through, and the reason
Yeah,
why
no,
it
I don't
won't
think
go
so either.
through is, well, because he just got elected, and his party was working very hard to get him elected, and there's been a bunch of different controversies around Joe Biden and his family, and the fact that none of these dissuaded those supporting him from electing him indicates that even if something big were to come out, it might not have an immediate impact.
Yeah,
Also,
for sure.
any investigation going on behind the scenes on Biden, perhaps by the FBI or some other agency, may become delayed due to the change in administration, and could be at risk of a conflict of interest leading to an investigation being canceled.
It's also my understanding that you can't really have any foreign like businesses in countries either as president. So in other words, you can't have like investments in foreign countries. Is kind of what I
That's
was
not
thinking.
true.
That's not true. Okay,
No.
because I was hearing people say that, but I was like, I'm not sure if that's
Well,
really.
Donald Trump has a bunch of stuff internationally. Now he handed off the management of his company to other members of his family so that he didn't have it directly. And while it is true that there could be a conflict of interest, the it only becomes a legal problem if something specifically violates the emoluments clause of the Constitution. Other than that, it's not a problem.
It's just I found that funny that there is already a impeachment thing going against Biden, and he's well. I don't know if it's been formally done yet, but was talk even before Biden uh, started his inauguration. So I mean, that's just I guess the new political culture that we live in now today, and maybe every president's going to have some sort of impeachment going their way. But that's anyway. It's, that just seems crazy to me.
Yes, I think the country is divided significantly, and even though Biden spoke very much about the unity that he desires to see in his inauguration speech, and it was something that was repeatedly emphasized by various other speakers. I listened to the whole event. The fact is that in Congress, in the House of Representatives, there's a different story. There are members of Congress who are calling for Trump supporters to be re educated, I would presume non voluntarily. Sort of similar to what China does to certain minorities, although probably they wouldn't be as extreme and cruel in their methods, I would say. But this is something that is very concerning. The fact that they are calling for the re education of their political opponents, they are calling for their political opponents to be rejected from Congress. And I think these kinds of political actions, rather than attempting to simply out debate the opponents and outvote the opponents in election, instead taking more direct attacks against the opposing position, is a sign of a decline of our political system.
Yes, for sure. We had a whole discussion in the past about money in politics, and we had you had very good points there as well about just how corrupt the system is itself, really. So I mean, it's just kind of interesting to think about at least modern politics in the way it's kind of become, especially when you compare it to kind of how the founding fathers wanted it to be, or even maybe later on, and how philosophers or how people uh, wanted the ideal system to be, so to speak. And I don't think that that's really what's happening now. But it's hard to keep things pure throughout time. So I mean, it makes sense from a historical perspective that it's going to change. But it's just interesting to find ourselves in this situation now when looking at Biden, because I think if you pick someone like Biden and say this is what people see America as being right now, it's chaos. People are so divided. People would be like, really, Biden, that guy, he's made it this way. And then some people may argue against that claim and say, well, Trump is the one that caused all of it. And maybe that's true, but it's just weird that Biden is now president, and this is what the way the country is.
Yes, it is a problem going forward. And I will say that if certain allegations concerning the election, which we're not allowed to discuss on YouTube, are true, then it is very likely that we will not see the resolution of this issue within the next 4 years or in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, for sure.
Now that being said, concerning the continuation of the Biden administration, particularly of Joe Biden himself, there are questions concerning his health which had been brought up, but were largely ignored by the media during the campaign. And there are allegations made that he consumes a drug called an amenda. While these allegations may be false due to the anonymity of the source, and it is probably very difficult to find out whether they are true due to HIPAA regulations. If they are true, hypothetically speaking, it could mean that Joe Biden will likely not be able to complete his term of presidency, or will be severely disabled in a mental way through his term as president due to his failing mental health, presumably. And behaviorally speaking, it has been observed that Joe Biden can get confused at times and sometimes fumbles with his words. And that is a problem, especially considering his age. It could be signs that his mind is in decline. So, if Joe Biden hypothetically does have dementia, then it is very likely that his situation will deteriorate over the years, and you may have a situation like Woodrow Wilson, where someone else has to take over the functions of the administration while the president is incapable, or perhaps even and perhaps resigning from office due to health issues. That is a serious possibility that a lot of people are considering, not just on the right but also on the left.
Yes, for sure. We heard this even before Biden's presidency, obviously, with the whole debate stage and everything. I think it was Trump, maybe not Trump, but I know somebody relatively big brought up the point of why Biden hasn't received a health exam. And some people were speculating as to reasons. And one of the more conspiratorial minds I had before, what I was thinking before, is maybe he did take it and failed, and knows that he failed, obviously, and they weren't going to release that. Now he's president, and if you really, really, really want to play conspiracy, he's going to use his failed health exam and failed health reasons and everything and blah 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 to get the 25th Amendment, or just step down and have Biden as the now president, or not Biden, Kamala as now president. But that's a kind of a little bit conspiratorial. But I do think that a lot of people start to think that are worried, maybe because of just the way Biden kind of presents himself. Because health is a big thing for president. I had a former government teacher in community college. He was basically said that people vote with like three things, and he said it was health and how much money they receive, how who they're going to be better off with, and I'm forgetting what the third reason was now. But I remember that the first one he said was health, because people in general just want to see a president that is healthy and kind of the figurehead for the country.
Yeah,
So it's rather interesting with Biden, because even if you're the most gracious of a person and take Biden,
you're cutting out.
even with speaking, sometimes he just kind of gets lost or combines words, and maybe it's nerves, but it happens too often for it to just be one excuse.
Yes, and I would say that he very visibly is having problems sometimes, and the question is, are these problems simply because he's put on the spot? Can is he good at thinking in the long term? Can he deal with problems in the long term? Perhaps he might just be having nerve problems, visibly speaking, and he might be fine mentally. However, the fact that these visible problems do exist could indicate that there is a deeper problem. And of course, Joe Biden is going to be a president who's older than Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan famously, towards the end of his presidency, was suffering quite heavily from Alzheimer's. So Joe Biden will be our oldest president that we've ever had. And of course, Donald Trump isn't getting any younger either. So
No.
he certainly needs to watch his health if he wants to challenge Biden in 2024. But nevertheless, we are seeing the oldest candidates. Well, perhaps there may have been older candidates, but the oldest presidents in the history of our country. And now, hypothetically, Joe Biden could make it through 4 years and run for re-election. But if he runs for re-election, he would really be taking a risk that, as it increasingly is possible at a great age, your health may deteriorate quite rapidly, especially if you are put under the stress of being the president of the United States.
And I believe Biden himself has said that he's only going to run one term as well. I've heard people mentioning it before. I haven't been able to find it for myself on where he might have said it, but it would make sense if he's just going to be a one term president and maybe pass it down to Kamala or something or somebody else. But
Yeah.
it would make sense because I don't even think himself wouldn't necessarily run for a second term, unless if Trump decides to run again, which is possible. But I don't even know if Trump is going to necessarily want to do that either after what he went through for 4 years. And maybe Trump is that narcissistic or whatever word you want to put in there and going to run again just to prove that America does like him or there was fraud for YouTube's sake there. Uh, it's possible, but I don't necessarily see Biden even wanting to run for a second term.
Yes. So that is a significant problem. Uh, Now, that being said, as Biden's administration does proceed, a number of executive orders have already come out. Now, as far as I was able to gather, the full text of these is not yet available for us to really review. However, the gist of things has been published at least. So I'm looking at a New York Times article where he signed 17 executive orders and other directives on his first day in office. And that is just yesterday as this is coming out. So so there's a number of different things that he published on. So here's the text. Mr. Biden has signed an executive order appointing Jeffrey D. Zients as the official COVID-19 response coordinator who will report to the president in an effort to aggressively gear up the nation's response to the pandemic in order also restores the Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense at the National Security Council, which Donald Trump had disbanded. And Joe Biden, in that executive order, will also require the use of masks and social distancing on all federal property, and will issue a 100-day masking challenge to the American people, encouraging them to wear masks for the next 100 days. And also encouraging state and local officials to make these mandates to wear masks. Now, that being said, he doesn't actually have the power himself to make a mandate on the state level for people to wear masks without Congress. However, since he does have the power to operate on the federal level and to determine how the federal government enforces its laws, he does have the ability to make a mandate on the federal level for people to wear masks while on federal property and to practice social distancing. Now, that being said, in my personal experience, as I did indeed go to a federal facility a couple months ago, I went to an IRS office, and people were required to wear masks and to social distance already before the Biden administration in that office. Now, it could be that it was specific to whoever was managing the IRS or that office specifically, or it could be something that was being practiced generally by the government. So I don't think that this actually changes that much about what is happening. I'm not hearing you. Yes, I am not hearing you currently. I don't know why I'm not hearing you, but I'm not hearing you. Checked, and everything seems to be functional.
Are we good now?
Yeah, yeah, I'm hearing you now. So, did you have something to say about that particular executive order?
Say that one more time.
Did you have something to say about that particular executive order in regards to the masks and social distancing?
Yeah, what I was basically trying to say, and I'm not really sure why it happened, but anyway, um, is I think the businesses and people themselves have already made up their minds on mask and if they're going to wear it or not. So I'm not really sure what a mandate's necessarily going to do. The only thing that mandates really do is feed into what people already think about the mask. So if you're somebody that doesn't like mask and think that it's just, government control, by Biden doing this executive order and mandate, you just see that Biden as being the president or the party or whatever you want to say that's trying to control everybody and be over everybody. And if you're somebody that is pro mask, you're going to see this mandate as something that's very good to slow the spread because masks work, blah blah blah. So I don't really think that the mandate really works on that level, but more as a perception level for what Biden's trying to do with a mask mandate and try to say that he's pro science because masks work. He's pro people because he's trying to not allow for people getting sick or dying and blah blah blah. So I really just think that this was just perception's sake.
Yeah, that is that is true. I think because as I said, from my personal experience on federal property, I already had a mandate when I went, but it could just be specific to that area, and it might not be something that necessarily applies to everyone. Now, of course, since congressmen have immunity, any congressman that refuses to wear a mask might still be able to, although it might come into conflict with the House Rules Committee. Now, another element of executive orders was relating to immigration. One of the things that Joe Biden did was he worked to expand deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, which, as to my knowledge, didn't really apply to a lot of people anymore due to its limitations. However, it could be expanded and renewed in a number of different ways, and that would have to occur more frequently due to Congress rather than presidential action. Now, that being said, he also He also put out another executive order which overturns a Trump executive order that pushed aggressive efforts to find and deport unauthorized immigrants. Now, this is somewhat ironic considering that Obama was nicknamed the deporter in chief due to the heavy amount of deportation that occurred during the Obama administration. So it's sort of interesting how, as political tides changed, the policies changed with that. And he also works to end what they like to call the Muslim ban, which blocks travel to the US from various countries, many of which are primarily Islamic. Now, personally, I think that the term Muslim ban is inaccurate and very frequently used to undermine the integrity of what is actually being done there. And first of all, not all Islamic majority countries are on that list. In fact, not even the largest one, Indonesia, was on the list. And also, I would say that the reason why these bans were made is not because these countries were Islamic. It was because of violence and risk of terrorism from those countries and had nothing to do with the Islamic nature of the countries themselves.
Right, yeah. I mean, I don't really know too much about the particulars of either of those for how they're necessarily going to make things happen, but I do know a little bit more about DACA than the Muslim ban in particular. And I don't really know what its impact is necessarily going to be in particular because we're kind of a smaller group, so to speak. But I would have to be more educated to know the impact of these particular executive orders and what they would necessarily mean. So I'm not really sure the particulars of what the impact of those executive orders is going to be.
Yeah. So another one of Biden's actions is to re-enter the Paris Climate Accords and also to re-enter the World Health Organization.
Yes, both of those. The Paris Accords is a rather interesting one because, and you can tell me if I'm wrong necessarily on this, but my understanding of the Paris Accords themselves is that it's a group of nations that get together and agree on, let's just say, carbon emissions and a lot of other things, and try to have a goal to better the environment and better the planet. But they don't have to meet those, so they're not legally binded or not punished or fined or whatever word you want to use if they don't meet those standards. It's more just like let's attempt to type of situation.
Yes, however, the way these standards would be met would be by the government taking full control of the country's ability to make carbon emissions, which would mean that every country that signs to the Paris Climate Accords necessarily signs that it will take or at least consider legitimate economic control by the government in order to specifically control these emissions, which means a government's ability to control various industries, the government's ability to control its electricity grid, a government's ability to control transportation, and interfere very broadly in private companies that might operate in all these fields.
Yeah, that makes sense. So would in Biden's situation, in Biden's administration, would you say joining the Paris Accords is going to give him and his cabinet members or just administration a chance to push more climate restrictions on businesses or on Americans for better economy. So in other words, is he using joining this as a branch or a motive to push more towards a safer environment in the United States?
Well, the Paris Agreement is somewhat related to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, another part of which is the Kyoto Protocol, which deals with more binding elements regarding emissions, which leads to the development of the carbon credits system, which allows countries to essentially charge people for the amount of emission that they put out. And carbon credits can be traded, and in fact, for early investors, can provide a pretty good opportunity to become extremely wealthy off of government policies. So this could be considered a form of rent seeking by people that invest into the carbon credits and then have governments sign up onto the carbon credits. So in that sense, there's a relation to that. However, the Paris Climate Agreement does not involve carbon credits. However, it works under the similar UN framework for this. So it all depends on how much farther the U.S. government is willing to go in these elements.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a little more sense to its impact because that makes some sense for sure. And he also joined the WHO again, wasn't it? Or the World Health Organization?
Yes, the World Health Organization. And the reason why the U.S. had left the World Health Organization is because the U.S. had suspected that Chinese interests were controlling elements of the organization so as to make the organization favorable to the Chinese government. And that
Right.
this would be seen in, for example, certain late responses of the World Health Organization to crises relating to the coronavirus event, and then later on making different recommendations. And the assumption is that if they had been more concerned with the lives of people, they would have listened to, for example, Taiwan, which allegedly the Taiwanese government had attempted to give certain information to the World Health Organization, but because the World Health Organization was opposed to the Taiwanese government, to the government of the Republic of China, and instead aligned with the People's Republic of China, they were unwilling to cooperate with the Taiwanese government in the early stages of the coronavirus event. And also their recommendation not to shut borders and to keep everything open business-wise in the early stages, as it was seen that the virus had a very high transmissibility, is considered by many people to be a greater concern for economic wealth of countries rather than the actual lives of people later on. Now, of course, ironically speaking, you could say that the situation has reversed, as now there are some people calling for very long-term shutdowns. And of course, this is negatively affecting especially a lot of smaller businesses that are not able to deal with this type of situation. However, large corporations certainly are making a profit due to having the infrastructure to deal with such situations, and also having losing competition of companies that are unable to deal with the situation, and being bailed out by the government in the cases in which they are unable to deal with the situation, and having a greater access to bailouts than small companies.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, especially with the small businesses, and your last point is a very big point about lockdowns, and there's been numerous debates on the impact, and new studies showing that maybe it didn't have an impact, and other studies showing that it is. It's just a whole mess, and the whole whole debate on what lockdowns, if they help or not. Uh, which is which is interesting itself. But it's kind of interesting about the WHO organization. On you can really see the two different perspectives of it. You have the perspective of him still in his last address calling it the China virus, and then you have Biden who's always called it COVID or coronavirus. So I think that that's kind of interesting as well, because I do think that Trump legitimately believes that China is the main reason for it. So I
Yeah,
also found that kind of
yeah.
interesting.
If I've got one criticism of the World Health Organization, it's their encouragement of the use of the terminology COVID instead of SARS coronavirus. I think that being more direct and accurate in the description of a virus is more important than trying to assuage the fears of the public. Although that's ultimately the road that they ended up trying to go down, was to emphasize the deadliness of a virus. But by then, the term COVID had already stuck with many people, even though it's not accurate.
Just understood that that was the slang of the whole word, and people didn't really want to say the whole thing, so COVID just kind of got adapted into media and into people's minds. That's kind of how I understood how the origin of that word happened.
Yeah. So anyway, going further on to Biden's executive orders, he also canceled the permit for the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline American segments. Of course, he can't do the Canadian ones. And he reversed rollbacks to vehicle emission standards, and he undid the decision to slash the size of several national monuments, enforcing a temporary moratorium on oil and natural gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and reestablishing a working group on the social costs of greenhouse gases.
And all those things were expected for Biden to do. Uh, yeah, I didn't really see any surprise for those particular viewpoints on what Biden took for executive orders. I think everybody who was relatively following politics expected those to happen.
Yes. Now, of course, I personally think that these events are likely to cause a more difficult recovery, especially considering how bad the economy is currently. If we're going to make more strict restrictions on what people can buy and sell and what businesses can start, it is going to lead to a more difficult economic recovery as the market is constricted by the government's regulation of these issues.
Yes, for sure. Out of those, just real quick, which one do you think might have the biggest impact for American or for the industry or whatever it might necessarily be?
Well, in the short term, I would say the Keystone XL pipeline because I'm sure a lot of jobs are resting on that. And the movement of petroleum is very important when it concerns the development of other countries. And of course, the UN, under its sustainable development programs, isn't very much concerned about the economic development of lesser countries in the world sphere. So it's more content that these countries stay poor than for them to develop uh, in a way that would cause emissions. And I think that that's a disservice to the citizens of those countries. But that being said, I do think that in the long term, the vehicle emission standards may become a problem because even though there already exist alternatives to petroleum based vehicles, electric cars, in fact, have existed for a very, very long time, all the way back to the early 1900s. But even then, they are still relatively expensive, and hybrid cars have their own problems in certain ways. So by restricting the market, it's going to be more expensive for people to move, and by making it more expensive for people to have vehicles, that's going to slow down the economic recovery.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, do you see any sort of agenda, sort of to like what California is doing with vehicles in particular for Biden? Do you see like stricter restrictions on vehicles and like what type of vehicle you have to have happening from the Biden administration for all of America?
Well, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know exactly what he will end up doing. It's pretty hard to tell at this point. It all depends on what Congress does, because Congress has a lot more power to deal with the actual economic regulation than the president has. The president can simply work based on laws that exist, while Congress can produce new laws. So it will really depend on what the Democrats in the House of Representatives choose to push forward. Now, of course, they will have opposition. However, I'm pretty sure that a lot of Republicans would side with the Democrats on very many different issues on on these things.
For sure. It always goes a little bit both ways, especially when you talk about more like radical uh, propositions and laws or ideas. But I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, yeah, I remember now. Do you, I mean, historically, every 2 years there's a change. So, historically, in 2 years from now, at midterms, Republicans are going to gain the House or the Senate, and there's going to break up the three-way power, so to speak, that Biden now has.
Well,
Um,
Republicans are currently ahead in the Senate, as far as I'm aware.
oh, okay.
I can double check right now.
I thought it was a tie or Democrats had won. Was what I thought it was, but maybe I'm wrong on that
Uh,
one.
no, right now it's 50-50. Okay.
So it's a tie. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I mean
So
that
the
leaves
Democrats are ahead in that sense because they have Kamala Harris.
right, but like what I was just saying, or you were saying, really about radical type of legislation is there's always room for a Democrat to decide not to agree with what they're saying as things become a little bit more
Yeah,
extreme.
but I
But
think
it goes both ways. So
I think that the Republicans are more likely to agree than the Democrats are to disagree.
I also agree with that point. I could definitely see like a Susan Collins going more towards a Democratic law or Democratic idea than
Is there a problem?
I definitely could see that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So on another issue, Donald Trump's 1776 commission will be rolled back by Biden, which was about looking at history in a certain way that enforces a pride in the founding of our country. Now, of course, this goes directly counter to a lot of the democratic elements recently, politically speaking, especially the last summer when a lot of monuments were aggressively and violently and illegally destroyed. Of these very founding fathers, which Donald Trump is attempting to, or was attempting to enforce a sort of national pride in. But ultimately, I will say that if we take the words of Niccolo de Machiavelli as useful, a republic, when it's in a time of crisis, needs to be able to return to the virtues of its founding. But if we are now in a situation where the founding itself has no virtues attached to it, and the founding fathers aren't seen as nuanced figures but as villains, historically speaking, then there isn't really a common ground that the Democrats and Republicans have anymore on what the virtue of being an American is.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting that perspective because I definitely think that, and maybe it's a little bit too generalized to say this, but the more democratic viewpoint views the founding fathers as racist are people who didn't necessarily weren't necessarily all good, rather than the right are Republicans, are conservatives, or whatever word you want to use. Because some of anyway, let's just keep it general. More conservatives view the founding fathers as being more of a history type of perspective, and that, and some even view it as being like 100% all good. But I mean, obviously, you can't take extremes too well. But I do think that that was very well in how you placed that, because I do think that there is very much a divide on depending on what party you vote for and how you view the founding fathers.
Yes, and I probably uh, have a completely different position from both sides, but that's just me. But anyway, uh, there's also the president, which is Joe Biden, designated Susan E. Rice, who is the head of his domestic policy council, as the leader of a robust interagency effort requiring all federal agencies to make rooting out systemic racism central to their work. His order directs the agencies to review and report on equity in the ranks within 200 days, including a plan on how to remove barriers to opportunities in policies and programs. The order also moves to ensure that Americans of all backgrounds have equal access to federal government resources, benefits, and services. It starts a data working group as well as the study of new methods to measure and assess federal equity and diversity efforts.
Yes, Biden has very much pushed the diversity uh, very far, because especially if you look at his cabinet members, a lot of people kind of criticize Biden over his cabinet members because they seem to be only diversity hires and don't have much experience for what their actual roles are and where they were hired to do. But it's very much all different types of people who are in his cabinet, and it's I don't know if it's I think it is really the first time that it's been this way for a president to have that many people of minorities or of sexual identity or whatever you want to necessarily say who are on the cabinet members. So I do think that Biden and administration is going to push for a lot of legislations through executive orders and whatnot to push for a more equal workforce or more diversity across corporate boards or whatever you want to necessarily say.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that my position on this issue is that while I do think that you're likely to be able to find capable people of any group that can fulfill an office, I don't think that specifically looking for diversity actually helps you, because very frequently socioeconomic situations will change how people's careers goes and how they uh, attempt to build their expertise, and also subcultures can change how this works as well, especially when you consider minority subcultures and subcultures that might be ethnically based. And because of that, it produces a situation where you're not actually likely to have an equitable distribution or even a proportional distribution based on of talent, that is, that you can draw on. So I think that by specifically forcing all these government agencies to look through this is sort of a waste of time. Not only because I don't think that it's something that they can solve, and that it's essentially a fool's errand, but I also think that this idea that there is a systematic racism in the U.S. government and in U.S. society is demonstrably false, to the point that not only is it a fabrication that such a thing actually exists, but also it is a hypocrisy because by working into this project, they are actually introducing racism in the analysis, which I think it is very easy to understand because there's a lot of people in the U.S. who are not racialized in their daily lives and how they think, and there are some who are. However, to say that this goes to the highest levels of our government, especially when we already have laws that deal with this specific issue, I think is absurd.
I don't really have anything else to add to that perspective. I agree with you in pretty much everything actually all of everything you said there. If anything, I think that by doing it, you are creating more, at least anger towards what you're doing, and most of the time, anger can come or go towards racism. But anyway, that's
Yes,
a
and I think that contrary to what critical race theory and intersectionality teaches people to think, that taking a colorblind approach to policymaking is obviously less racist than taking a race conscious approach that calls for equity. I think it's common sense that it's less racist. And the fact that these people redefine racism in a way to specifically force people to think about race makes people more racist, not only on their side, but also it causes a reaction of people who now realize that their political opposition is working in terms of racial thought. And this reaction will lead those people to counter with their own racial thought to deal with the fact that they're attacked based on racial thinking. So it essentially, by assuming that a problem exists which doesn't exist, it is in fact creating the problem that they are attempting to solve.
right. I do think I do think if you have even candidates, that maybe there should be more diversity for the workplace if candidates are even in skill level. But that being said, I do think that people in general and businesses in general, and you would think government in general, would want to put people in those positions that are the most qualified and able to do their job. So
Yes,
I do think that there's a lot to that.
we should always desire to have the best person in office for the job. And if two people are equal in skill level, I'm not in favor of choosing the person that gets in based on that person's race. I'm in favor of analyzing more, perhaps looking at the character of a person, perhaps looking at the experience of a person, and then basing it on that. Because there are no two people that are exactly the same.
That's a hypothetical situation you'll hear when you start talking about diversity in the workplace, and people will be always like, okay, well, take that there's one black and one white, but they're all skilled. And I always thought, even when I heard this in like seventh grade, I'm like, well, businesses aren't necessarily just going to look at the resume and say, okay, they have everything the same on the resume, went to the same college. It would be very unlikely. But even if you give the resume being the same, who the person is and their experience maybe outside of what they put as achievements is going to determine who they hire.
Yeah,
Like
I
no
mean,
candidate's going to have the same stuff.
if you essentially have two people that are somehow quantum entangled to be exactly identical in everything but their race, then at that point I'll just flip a coin because I don't care as long as the person that's competent gets in. So
Right. Right.
yeah. So going further into Joe Biden's executive orders, he another executive order reinforces Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to require that the federal government does not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, a policy that reverses action by Mr. Trump's administration. And I think this might have to do perhaps with the military. That's what it might be referring to. Donald Trump banning people who are transgender from the military.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that one was talking about either.
But essentially, the argument here is that the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which talks about non-discrimination, doesn't actually at any point explicitly mention anything about LGBT plus people at all. But the Supreme Court has decided that despite the fact that the law doesn't mention anything, despite the fact that the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention anything, that they are going to assume that it would have mentioned it if it had been an issue, which I don't think is good legal practice. If they want to make a law on non-discrimination, they should make a law rather than reinterpreting existing laws to mean anything they want.
Right. It's easy to add two laws, really.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge problem that the Supreme Court has had, is the way it deals with the laws. I think that a lot of the founding fathers would have preferred that the Supreme Court did not act in ways which reinterpreted laws not only to stretch the meaning of what the text says, but to apply to something that the law does not apply to at all in any explicit sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people might say, what if people are in favor of this? Well, let's say hypothetically someone does this to a law that you're not in favor of. And someone expands something somewhere that you don't like. So for people that are in favor of this happening, I will say that this is not necessarily a problem relating to whether or not transgender people and people that are LGBT should be allowed into the military, but rather is a problem with how laws are handled in this country. And if laws can mean anything that the court wants them to mean, then there's no real point in having laws. And it essentially destroys the legal fabric of the country and makes it a lot more difficult to run the country. So people that are very happy about legal decisions, I would seriously encourage them to think in the long term on the damage that this causes to the actual legal fabric of a country. If you want to have a law, you should make the law and not reinterpret laws to mean things that they clearly were not intended to apply to.
I do think it would be dangerous to add too much to law, so I could see why some people would argue for interpretation rather than just keep adding to the ongoing list. But I definitely understand with what you're saying, because I do think you would get more of an actual beating to what you want to put for an extension on the law by writing the new one and explicitly saying what you mean, and not just kind of going with like fluffiness around and saying, well, this kind of means this, we interpret it this way, but we don't really necessarily tell you in the future if something were to come up how to view it for a new law that was written for it, if that makes sense, if I explain that well. But that's
Yeah.
kind of how I view that.
Mr. Biden is moving to extend a federal moratorium on evictions and has asked agencies, including the Agriculture, Veterans Affairs, and Housing and Urban Development departments, to prolong a moratorium on foreclosures on federally guaranteed mortgages that was enacted in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The extensions all run through at least the end of March. Now, I will say that if this is a moratorium on foreclosures on federally guaranteed mortgages, I think that's fine. If the government promised to pay money, then it shouldn't be the person that got stuck in between the government and whoever else that should suffer. However, the problem is that if this were to be extended, economically speaking, universally and not just to federal related events, you would end up in a situation where people are much more reluctant to become landlords, and people might choose not to be landlords who are already landlords, which would lead to a housing crisis. In other words, what I'm saying is, as much as people are opposed to the idea of evictions, if you put too much pressure on landlords, you're going to end up in a situation where it's going to be extremely hard to find a place to live.
Because they're going to be super restrictive, or
Because there's going to be less people who are actually willing to be landlords, and less people that are willing to rent out homes because it might be completely unprofitable to do so.
right, right. So you're almost taking out the business perspective of being a landlord.
Yeah, and that's the problem here, because I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, we shouldn't evict anyone," but I say, well, this is also a problem for the landlords, because if nobody gets evicted, then the landlords just run out of money because they're still paying taxes on the property. So that's pretty hard on the landlords, is what I'm saying, because a lot of people hate on landlords, but we actually need the landlords for the people that aren't homeowners. They need some place to live, and if we get rid of the landlords, then those people will have a really hard time finding a place to live.
Right. Yeah. I think it'll be interesting the percentage of people that actually live under a landlord, because I think it's would be a lot of people, because
Yeah.
there's especially younger types of people where before they actually have a home for themselves, are a family for that matter, or whatever you want to whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
I
but
think a lot of people live under
yeah,
landlords.
but this is also specifically dealing with mortgages, so it's not necessarily landlords. It's dealing with uh, the bank having your house as collateral for the mortgage, and then the bank sending people to evict you. That
Right.
that kind of stuff as well. So it's not necessarily the same thing, but it's similar. So I would say that if it's federally guaranteed, it makes sense that they would do this, but they need to be careful, because if they move too far with these types of restrictions, they're going to severely damage the economy in the long term.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the president is also moving to continue a pause on federal student loan interest and principal payments through the end of September. Although progressive groups and some congressional Democrats have pushed Mr. Biden to go much further and cancel up to $50,000 in student debt per person. Now the
I
thing
mean, all
is,
you have to.
the government has guaranteed the debt, so it would mean that instead of coming out of the students, it would come out of the taxpayers if that were to happen.
Yeah, because that's the obvious question: is where's this money going to come from if the students are the ones that have to pay it?
Yeah, and of course, a heavier tax burden is going to make it a lot harder to recover from the economy, because the people that get taxed pretty hard are businesses, and the people that are students generally don't pay a lot of taxes. and aren't employing a lot of people. So that leads to a sort of imbalance in the economic hierarchy on how the money is being transferred.
Right, yeah. The whole student loan debate is, I think the system itself probably needs to be changed just a little bit, but I don't really think it makes too much sense to try to necessarily get rid of all student loans or even necessarily a high percentage of student loans because you run into numerous problems with trying to do so.
Yeah. So I think what Biden's biggest action was is that he issued a freeze on all new regulations put in motion by his predecessor to give his administration time to evaluate which ones it wants to move forward. So this essentially means that Joe Biden is freezing all of Donald Trump's executive orders from the last 4 years, essentially resetting the government, at least from the presidential side of things, to how it was before Trump entered office.
Yeah, that's a kind of crazy, I think. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it might have happened in the past from a historical perspective, but that just seems crazy that you can even necessarily do that. Everybody knew that he was going to pass executive orders and overturn executive orders, but the fact that he's frozen everything is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, and that includes presumably the regulation where, in order to make a regulation, you have to get rid of two regulations.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it seems that Biden and the Democrats are very intent on essentially avoiding Donald Trump having any positive legacy. Because
They're trying
regardless,
to knock it all down, yeah.
yeah,
Oh, sorry, go.
yeah, because regardless of what you think about Donald Trump's foreign policy or whether he was too harsh on the borders or various other things, it is worth noting that the economy until the coronavirus hit was actually a very strong economy, and that towards the end he did have some success in mediating peace deals with various countries. However, I would say that throughout the entirety of Donald Trump's presidency, there was a very strong opposition to him, much stronger than Barack Obama had ever experienced. One that went from the media to the social media to the opposition in government uh, to various activist groups to all levels of society. There was a very strong opposition to Donald Trump. Various conspiracy theories regarding Donald Trump were propagated, which were ultimately found to be baseless. For example, the Trump Russia collusion. There's compilations people make about various people in the news talking about it for months on end, and then nothing comes out of it. So this is interesting, and it could be that now the same thing will happen to Biden from his opposition, as there was an escalation from the opposition against Obama to the opposition against Trump. There might be an escalation in the degree of opposition people had to Trump to the degree of opposition that some people have to Joe Biden, which would obviously be the opposite of Joe Biden's desire for unity. But I think that people aren't going to forget what was done to Donald Trump in his administration. And there are likely a lot of people that think that now it is entirely legitimate to do something similar to Joe Biden. Although I would point that the people with the potential to do these things are a lot less prominent and a lot less powerful on the Trump side than on the Biden side.
Right. Trump had kind of the mass media sources all going against him, and I think Biden's going to have a lot of like the alternative media sources going against him. I don't necessarily see a mass media outlet really going that much against Biden, like you saw CNN go against Trump. Maybe like a Newsmax, but I don't know how much you're going to put into a Newsmax more than like say a CNN. So I really think most of what Biden's going to face is going to be from alternative media sources through YouTube or radio maybe or alternative media basically.
That's well, YouTube. That's assuming
Maybe not
that
if they let you. Yeah,
if they let you, because there
yeah,
there has been a huge purge of various voices from YouTube, from Twitter, from Facebook in response to recent events, and even going so far as these companies actively attempting to shut down their competition. So not only are these people removed from having a platform on these companies' platform, but they are deplatformed by the removal of the competition to them. So I think that this direct attempt to eliminate the opposition rather than simply allowing them to have an alternative and allowing them to perhaps debate their position is a sign of the degradation of civility in the political discourse.
yeah. You're most recently seeing this with Parler and Amazon Web Services knocking them off, and now Parler is even going towards a lawsuit because they might have breached contract, uh, which would be interesting to see what comes of that. But it is a very interesting topic on what the opposition is going to be for against Biden because YouTube, as you were discussing, and as a lot of people probably know, likes to at least suppress those type of alternative viewpoints. So I wonder. My theory is I wonder if there's going to be an alternative media source like YouTube that comes up during Biden's presidency.
Well, we're already seeing Rumble, uh,
Mhm.
BitChute. There are alternatives, and they're going to have to shore themselves up because companies like Google, Twitter, and Facebook are moving hard against them. I will point out, however, that the mainstream media, as some people have pointed out, may actually suffer from a severe drop in ratings due to the lack of reporting on Trump, because they essentially people talk about bread and circuses. Well, the media circus around Donald Trump that existed constantly for the past 5 years was something that really helped the media gain a lot of ratings in a time when a lot of people were beginning to move away from traditional media sources. And now that the circus, if it collapses, if they're not going to continue reporting on Trump and on the opposition in some way, that could be bad for the mainstream media, and they may find it more difficult to compete in a post-Trump political climate. Also, I would say another potential event is Trump forming a new political party in opposition to the Republicans, because many people think that a lot of people in the Republican leadership really did not treat Trump in a favorable manner. Now, if this does happen, it will provide a lot of opportunity for perhaps up and coming politicians to gain influence and power, either by joining Trump's new party or by attempting to replace the lost elements of the Republican Party. However, judging by the political climate, it is likely that only one of the two parties will become dominant. However, this can be essentially, it can wait for about 3 years, essentially. What I mean by that is that in 2 years, when the midterm election is concluded and new congressmen get in, that is the opportunity for the parties to be in competition with each other. However, once a presidential election occurs, that situation will mean that people will be more likely to be unified, nationally speaking, under a particular party. So if Trump wants to form a party, he has to move fast to beat the Republicans in 2 years so that he can then beat the Democrats in 4 years.
Right, because I mean, historically speaking, there really hasn't been that much of a major third party in the United States politics. So I definitely agree that Trump's party, if it were to happen, would definitely have to replace the Republican Party as we know it today. But it would be if Trump decides to do that, it would make my question. I believe I asked you on the earlier show before on which party is now considered to be more weaker or more likely to break up, and it would definitely go more towards the Republican eyes because I think before this election cycle, I was thinking it was more Democratic because of the progressive left that was in their party, but I definitely think the right is much more fractured after Trump's loss and how politics is looking today.
Well, I would say in theory they're all left wing, but that really goes into
Yeah,
political theory. But um, now that being said, there was another point I wanted to make, but I don't remember it off the top of my head.
yeah, I had a point leave my head earlier today too.
Yeah, that happens from time to time. But there you go. So ultimately, I would say that the Biden administration is going to bring a lot of changes, uh, a lot of restoration to the Obama era in certain elements of policy, and perhaps a lot of new opportunities for up and coming politicians.
I guess if I had to summarize what I see from a Biden presidency, I see again kind of a return to normal. And I think the normal that Biden is talking about is similar to Obama in what he pushed forward. I definitely think that he's kind of trying to go in Obama's footsteps. And I definitely think that we're going to see a continuation of executive orders to get things done, despite there being power in the Senate and in the House. I still think that Biden's going to rely maybe a little bit heavier than Trump on actual executive orders to pass some of what he wants to get done.
Yeah, I would say similar to Barack Obama, who relied quite heavily on executive orders.
Right? Yeah, I think both of them are the same on that.
Yeah. So anyway, do you have any closing remarks?
No, I think we said everything I was thinking about and for questions and statements, so I'm good on mine.
Okay, in that case, I'd like to thank everybody for watching, our beautiful audience. Thank you very much for watching. If you have anything you'd like to say, please put it in the comments section below. And we may address it in the future, perhaps, but it all depends on what happens. But anyway, thank you for watching, and we will be seeing you next week, presumably, unless something changes on your channel, in fact. So be ready for that. Goodbye.